Hello, my name is Michael Willoughby. I'm a CFA charter holder, and I also hold a PhD in economics from Columbia University, and currently I'm teaching economics at the University of California, San Diego. Right now, we're going to start CFA Level 1 and do microeconomics. Microeconomics is the part of economics that studies price behavior. One of the easiest ways to think about microeconomics is it involves prices and choices. It looks at the behavior of firms in determining levels of output, prices, and how they compete with each other. All microeconomics is organized around supply and demand curves, things that most of us hear about but may not be intimately familiar with. Supply and demand curves are a relatively recent innovation in economics. They didn't come about until the 1890s, when John Marshall at Cambridge put the two together. Ever since then, we've used supply and demand as a means of analysis of market behavior. Let's start with the demand curve. And the underlying features of the demand curve come from something we call the indifference curves. Now, what we'll do is we'll develop the downward sloping demand curve through a comparison of choices across two goods. And let's do that by looking at this chart. What I've done here is to use a simple two-space coordinate system where I'm going to put quantities of one good up here at the top. Let's take beer, for example. And along the horizontal axis, pizza over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare consumer choice across these two goods, given the consumer's preferences and the prices, relative prices of each. Now, the way this is constructed is I'll start out by positing a price of beer and pizza relative to each other. The actual dollar amount of the two doesn't matter. What matters is the relative price of beer and the relative price of pizza. Don't be fooled by the chart, and in particular this green line. It's green because we're going to use it to construct what is the budget or the monetary constraint of the consumer. The fact that this line takes us higher on the beer axis than the pizza axis doesn't tell us that beer costs more than pizza. In fact, it tells us the opposite. Beer is cheaper because with any given amount of money, the consumer can have more beer and no pizza, or this amount of pizza and no beer. Beer is approximately half the cost of pizza. Within this triangle is the total monetary wealth of this particular consumer given this line. You could also think of this, sometimes it makes it easier, if we were to put nickels and dimes on these axes. Nickels are cheaper than dimes down here. So $1, for $1 you can have 20 nickels, or you can have 10 dimes. Or you can have any combination of nickels and dimes. And that maybe you have 18 nickels and 2 dimes. So here's our monetary constraint, and here's the maximum amounts of the two goods we can have. The line, or the slope of this line, tells us the relative prices of pizza and beer. Let's go to the purple convex curve here. This is the indifference curve. Indifference curves are convex, and what they convey is the consumer's preferences for beer and pizza. Where the green line or the budget line gives us the market exchange rate, we think of the indifference curve here as giving us the consumer's preference rate of exchange, or the rate they're willing to trade beer, less beer, for more pizza, and still be indifferent with respect to the combination of the two. What we find is that in order to maximize satisfaction, consumers would like to have the indifference curve that's farthest into the space of beer and pizza. They're happier with more beer and more pizza than less beer and less pizza, so the higher the indifference curve, the happier the consumer. And how do we get the highest indifference curve given our budget? We find the highest point or highest indifference curve that we can achieve given our budget. And that would be right here. So I'll circle this first point where we have the intersection of the indifference curve with the budget line. At this point, we would say that the consumer has maximized their satisfaction given these two prices. Cheaper beer, remember, more beer for the same amount of money than pizza. Cheaper beer than pizza, highest indifference curve. If we start from that point and then increase our budget, that is, move the wealth constraint out without changing the slope, that's as if we have more money but the same relative prices. Now I can have more beer, now I can have more pizza, and what do I choose? I choose a combination that's at a higher level of indifference. Now what we say is that the movement upwards in both beer, and more pizza reflects the income effect. That is, with more income, I can have more beer than before, and I can have more pizza than before. That's called the income effect. The income effect does not demonstrate the downward sloping law of demand. What does is to change the prices of one of the two goods. To do that, I'm going to hold fixed the amount of beer that I can have at the price of beer, but what I'll do now is I'll make pizza cheaper. So that means that I can now have more pizza, same amount of beer, but more pizza. Pizza is now cheaper. What happens? Well, with this new budget constraint, where pizza is cheaper, the slope is flatter and favors pizza, what will I choose? Well, the same level of indifference, the way I've constructed these, is I now have my points income effect, more money, same prices. Now, same money, cheaper pizza. I'm down here on the higher indifference curve. And notice what's happened. I now purchase more pizza. Remember, first income, first amount of pizza. More income, more pizza. But same income, cheaper pizza. I now buy more pizza. How much beer do I buy? Turns out I buy less. Less beer when the price of pizza is lower, but the income is the same. This is what we call the substitution effect. The substitution effect is what gives us the downward sloping demand curve. When something becomes more expensive, we buy less of it. And what's happened here in relative terms is that with a decrease in the price of pizza, pizza is cheaper, forcing beer to be more expensive relative to pizza. Substitution effect, I move into pizza, I move out of beer, substituting pizza for beer when pizza becomes cheaper. Now I hope what I've done is establish the background for the downward sloping law of demand. That is, demand curves being downward sloping simply mean that in order to sell higher quantities, prices need to be lower. Anytime prices rise, quantities demanded will go down. Anytime prices are reduced, they'll go up. It's important to note, however, that we're not talking simply about explicit prices, we're talking about relative prices. So the relative price of something can increase if other prices decrease, and vice versa. What I want to do next is put together some numbers to help illustrate some combinations of prices and quantities and what they do, and lead us to an important concept on the demand side of microeconomics called elasticity.